things I do for love.
Game of Thrones has dominated the social consciousness pretty much since its debut. It beautifully adapted the seemingly unadaptable work of George R.R. Martin. It shocked audiences by constantly subverting their expectations, and it weaved together fascinating stories about complex and realistic characters. Of all the show's many accomplishments, what has always stood out the most to me is the way it handles death. Part of Game of Thrones' reputation has always been tied to the disposability of its characters, regardless of how big of a role they play in the story or how much viewers love them. Really, it started as a show centered around dealing with grief. It explored the many ripples death creates, whether that be on a personal level or a global one, and I can't think of many shows that have done a better job of handling death than Game of Thrones.
You're learning.
With that said, I also can't think of many shows that have done a more disappointing job of handling death than Game of Thrones. What was once a pervasive threat always hanging over the story became a tool used to simplify the narrative by taking out characters who weren't at the top of the billing list. One of the easiest things to point to for this shift is the show catching up with its source material. Without Martin's work to pull from, David Benioff and Dan Weiss had to make the transition from adapters to creators. In some ways, it started to feel like a show that was trying to imitate Game of Thrones instead of just being Game of Thrones. They gave heightened versions of what the series was known for, but they missed the intricacies that made the show special in the first place, especially in regards to death. So I want to look at death throughout this series, and examine both the show's successes and shortcomings in the hopes of learning more about how to use death effectively in a story. If it wasn't obvious already, beware of spoilers. There are many different ways and reasons to kill a character. In Game of Thrones specifically, death is used to give the story shape. Some deaths aim to shake the narrative to its core by killing off beloved characters who seem untouchable. Others, especially those of more minor characters, are primarily meant to provide motivations for the main cast, and others act as a sort of respite from the copious amounts of tragedy that Game of Thrones provides by taking out those who deserve it most. These three kinds of deaths are what the show revolves around. However, while the deaths of minor characters and villains are massively important to what makes Game of Thrones so special, one of the greatest feats of the series, and obviously the novels it's based on, is how it is able to kill main characters, and not only have the audience want to keep watching, but to be more invested than ever. And of course, this starts with the death of Ned Stark. Ned's death sets the tone and conflict for pretty much the rest of the series. In Season 1, he's presented as the main character and most of the major conflicts center around him, which all makes Ned feel like someone who will be in the show for the long haul, fighting for good. But obviously that's not the case. Ned dies and it affects the story in many different ways. From a character level, it creates a powerful moment where Ned loses everything. He betrays his core value of honor in an effort to protect his daughters and to a far lesser extent, himself. However, it's all for naught as he dies anyway, and his daughters are thrust into situations that put them into more danger than ever. His death also sends the message to viewers that this is not a story where being the hero will get a character far. In fact, being a hero can be more of a liability than anything else. Furthermore, it shows that even if a character eventually plays by the twisted rules of those in power, it only takes the bidding of an insane Child King to end those best laid plans. From a story standpoint, Ned's end solidifies the major conflict of the show. His death marks a point of no return. War is unavoidable, and that is something that hangs over the heads of nearly every primary character for the entire series. It creates emotional fallout that is explored in the stories of many characters. We watch those who loved him grieve in their different ways, and we see those who considered him an enemy respond with frustration about how things have escalated. What's more is it puts characters into interesting situations. It leaves Sansa alone in the lion's den. It sets Arya on the road and on the run. It forces Jon to decide where his true place is. It puts Robb and Cat on the path to war, and it leads Tyrion to becoming Hand of the King. Ned's death accomplishes a lot of different things from a story perspective, and it has massive repercussions that 7 seasons later still feel relevant. Obviously, not every character death can or should have as large of an effect on a story as Ned's does, but there are a couple key aspects of how his death impacts the narrative that can be seen in the other great deaths in the series. First off, it happens while his arc is most relevant, meaning viewers are invested in his character more than ever. Second, it creates emotional fallout for the other characters that they are forced to explore, giving them new motivations, and lastly, it leads to conflict, thus pushing the story forward. Like, look at Robb and Cat. Their downfall happens as they're in the midst of trying to regain an upper hand in the War of the Five Kings, and it comes right after a series of mistakes on both of their parts. Just when things seem like they're about to get better, everything ends. It's abrupt, but given their mistakes, it feels like the natural end to their stories. By that point in the series, viewers have been trained to know that no matter who a character is, too many mistakes leads to tragedy. And so Robb is forced to watch his wife and unborn child be slaughtered in front of him. Kat witnesses her firstborn son being murdered. She dies still believing that Bran and Rickon are dead and that Jon is Ned's bastard. They both die unfulfilled, which as a viewer who can see the full story, is beyond tragic. Their deaths also symbolize the Starks losing the War of the Five Kings. It really feels like the end of their house. This is compounded by the fact that at this point of the story, most of the Stark children are in the process of losing their identities. Bran is blurring the line between himself and Summer. Arya has been posing as various orphans throughout her travels. Sansa is married into the Lannister family and has to learn to always wear a mask. Jon is walking the thin line between posing as a wildling and being one, and Rickon is not important. Robb and Kat were really the only members of the Stark family who could still openly be Starks, and with them dead, none of the remaining family members are in a position to rule Winterfell, to carry on Ned's legacy. They're forced to find their own path. Sansa relies entirely on strangers to escape King's Landing, knowing that her brother will never come for her. Arya decides to leave Westeros to find Jack and Hagar, and Jon is again put in a position where he needs to decide where his duty lies, and he ends up taking the mantle of Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. All hope of the Starks winning the war, the side that most viewers of the show will be rooting for, seemingly dies with Robb and Kat. It opens the door for new monsters to get a footing in the game for the Iron Throne, and new conflicts sprout because of that. Their deaths are felt on all of these different levels, and that is a large part of what makes the Red Wedding so powerful. These same elements can be seen in the deaths of smaller characters as well, like Oberyn Martell. Although Oberyn is only in the show for a handful of episodes, he immediately establishes himself as a likable character. He's witty with an interesting shade of morally gray, which describes most of the best characters in Game of Thrones. Above all, he volunteers to protect everyone's favorite man, Tyrion. Oberyn's death is sad and shocking because he is seeking justice for the murder of his sister, and that's snatched from him at the last second. His death is also tied to the fate of Tyrion, a character that viewers have been growing close to for 4 seasons. So even if they don't care all that much for Oberyn, his death brings on all sorts of problems for a character they most likely do care about, creating an emotional stake in him. Beyond this, Oberyn dying pushes Tyrion to act drastically. All Tyrion has ever wanted was to be a Lannister, but his family does everything in their power to not let that be, despite them being similar to him in so many ways. Oberyn's death shines the final light on this conflict and brings Tyrion to his darkest place. This action is a large reason everything spirals out of control in King's Landing, and it starts with Oberyn. His death also creates conflict for Ellaria Sand and the Sand Snakes, making them serious potential threats for the Lannisters. Especially early in the series, there is no shortage of deaths that happen to characters who are relevant to the narrative, that lead to personal growth for others, and create new problems across the realm. Lady's death raises the stakes for Sansa, Arya, and Ned. It is their first taste of what Cersei and Joffrey are capable of, and it establishes a conflict between Arya and Sansa, and Ned and Robert. Also, Lady's a good pup, and good pups deserve better. Jory dies after promising Arya that he'll protect Ned, showing that despite having Northmen around, Ned and his family are extremely vulnerable in King's Landing. Robert's death creates a vacuum of power across Westeros, leading to the War of the Five Kings. This creates conflict for everyone in the kingdom, and it also puts Ned in a dangerous and difficult situation, as losing Robert means losing one of the only people in King's Landing who actually cares about him. Syrio's death acts as a major motivation for Arya, helping jumpstart her list. Khal Drogo's death happens just as he's preparing to take Dany to Westeros, and it puts her further from the throne than ever. Renly's death takes away a seemingly good option of a ruler, it creates internal and external conflicts for Kat and Brienne, and it leads to many other kingdom-wide consequences, the most notable being the Tyrells siding with the Lannisters. Maester Luwin's death leaves Bran with no more parental figures in his life, meaning he has to rely on the help of other children and a sweet, simple man.
Hodor.
Jeor Mormont's death leads to the fracturing of the Night's Watch and puts characters viewers care about, namely Sam, in grave danger. Ygritte's death shows both her and Jon's unwillingness to betray what they believe in, and how their duty, whether it be to the protection of the realm or fighting for freedom, is more important than their personal happiness. These deaths, big or small, not only serve as satisfying ends to the arcs of each character, but they also echo throughout the series, leading to interesting character growth and conflicts for those who survive. A lot of these same ideas even apply to characters who viewers are actively hoping will die. The main difference is instead of grieving those deaths, most viewers will celebrate them. The most iconic of these is Joffrey's.
Hurry up, this pie is dry.
Just before he dies, he is at a peak point of awfulness. His marriage to Marjorie would give him more power as a king than ever, his animosity towards Tyrion has hit an all-time high, and he has been threatening Sansa in worse ways than ever, showing that he is becoming more and more dangerous. Most viewers probably started hating Joffrey enough to hope he dies somewhere in the early parts of season 1, but he persists. His army pushes back Stannis, he outlives Renly and Robb, and it seems like there is no one left to take him down. And then he chokes it and dies an excruciatingly painful death that he no doubt deserves. Where the best deaths of the main heroes of the stories happen after them making one too many mistakes, the best deaths of villains come when they're at the most dangerous. Viserys gets his golden crown after nearly killing Dany and her unborn child. Lysa is pushed from the moon door after threatening to throw Sansa out of it. Tywin takes a crossbow bolt to the gut just after showing his willingness to let his own son die for a crime he knows he did not commit. There is a release of tension with these deaths, as they happen just after those characters commit some of their worst acts, and just before they plan to do even more terrible things. These deaths also create emotional fallout and further conflict for the other characters. Viserys' death shows how hardened Dany has become, and it makes her the rightful heir to the Iron Throne. Joffrey's death sets Tommen as king, causes Cersei to start unraveling, and puts Tyrion in grave danger. Tywin's death removes a voice of relative reason from the king's council, leaving room for the new king to be manipulated by everyone else around him. And Lysa's death gives Littlefinger more power than ever, allowing him to play the game more openly than before. Their deaths leave a print on the story in the same way that the deaths of more likable characters do, and those remaining need to live with the consequences. No matter the kind of death, the majority of ones from the first 4 seasons are timed well. Major deaths of beloved characters are spread out just enough to not be exhausting, and the deaths of the most reviled ones are peppered in to relieve some of the tension that hangs over the show. However, once season 5 came around, the way the show handled death started to feel a little different. While the earlier deaths in Game of Thrones were used to create long-remembered conflict, deaths in the later seasons seemed more focused on simplifying the narrative. The shock of a character dying started to have more to do with sheer brutality than anything else. Also, deaths started to focus more on servicing the arcs of major characters than delivering satisfying ends to the characters who are actually dying. If the majority of those kinds of deaths had led to interesting character growth, while not ideal, it would have been more understandable. But really, most of the deaths that happen in the later seasons are quickly forgotten by the characters, and any developments that do come from them typically either have weak payoffs or happen so quickly they feel jarring. Like with Shireen Baratheon, her death is one of the most chilling in the series, and it leads to a lot of potential exploration for Davos. It sets the groundwork for him to confront Stannis, the man he has stood behind throughout the entire show, and come to terms with the fact that he has helped the monster gain power. But Stannis dies before Davos even learns of Shireen's death. While I was happy to see Brienne get revenge, her grudge had lost a lot of steam by that point, so I would have rather seen Davos get the chance to confront him. From Shireen's death on, Davos doesn't do a whole lot except act as a comic relief. He does have one great scene where he confronts Melisandre about what happened, but there isn't much beyond that. It doesn't end up changing his character in any major way. From a narrative standpoint, this made the death seem like there wasn't much of a purpose for it, aside from shocking viewers with brutality. Another example of the show not doing a robust enough job of exploring the emotional fallout of death can be seen in Dany's arc, primarily with the deaths of her dragons, Viserion and Rhaegal. Early in the series, Dany's dragons are constantly referred to as her children, but this kind of gets dropped in the later seasons, and she doesn't seem to really care about them all that much. After Viserion is killed by the Night King, Dany has one scene where she's in clear mourning and then never seems to think about his death again, despite fighting against his reanimated corpse. I wish the show had spent a little more time on how much the loss affected her, and I would have loved a scene where she tries to appeal to the zombified Viserion to no avail. It would have made a little more sense than Jon just yelling at him. Rhaegal's death gets a little more emotional exploration and spurs change in Dany, but it also misses the mark. His death, along with Jorah and Missandei's, are all meant to push Dany over the edge. I get what they were going for, but it leads to a conclusion that didn't feel earned to me because it comes so quickly, and Dany's relationship with all of those characters hasn't been much of a focus for a while. Had they explored her grief over losing Viserion more heavily, given her more scenes bonding with Jorah and especially Missandei, and had Rhaegal die at the Battle of King's Landing instead of the ambush by Dragonstone, I think her decision to burn the city to the ground would have felt a little more built to. Instead, it asks viewers to fill in the gaps that the show didn't have time to explore. On top of not exploring grief all that thoroughly, a lot of the characters who die in the later seasons are ones who either have been absent for a while or have been fairly irrelevant to the narrative for some time. To me, this feels like a cheap way for the writers to kill recognizable characters who seem important, thus maintaining the reputation of the show, without needing to develop them a whole lot or spend time on the emotional fallout of their deaths. Take Osha and Rickon. They come back after being away for multiple seasons, get one scene to reintroduce them as characters, and a second one to die. Osha's death is sad because she's a likable character, but it doesn't have a lasting impact on anything. It really only serves to get viewers to hate Ramsay Bolton even more, which isn't necessary. Rickon's death, while powerful in the moment, ultimately suffers the same issue. Even when Rickon was regularly on the show, viewers didn't have much of a connection to him as he was too young to play a big role in the story. Rickon's not really a character most viewers will have an emotional connection to. So the only real purpose of his death is to get Jon to react irrationally, which he does, but even this doesn't have a real consequence. Jon charges and gets away unscathed. No one who viewers care about dies despite his rash choice, and although a lot of Northmen are killed in the fight, he still becomes King of the North. Rickon's death is forgotten about once the battle ends, and it seems to matter so little that when the rest of the Stark children reunite, they don't even address it, which rings hollow. Maybe this is cynical, but it feels like something the writers did to get rid of the problem of there being a clear Stark heir in Winterfell. Him dying isn't sad because viewers care about him, it's sad because viewers care about the other Starks who care about him, but even they don't really seem to care that much. Ultimately, it asks for an emotional payoff without doing the work of creating an actual relationship between Rickon and any of his siblings. The same thing happens with Marcella, who comes back to the show after being gone for a handful of seasons and promptly dies in Jaime's arms in what I think is supposed to be an emotional moment. However, as viewers haven't been given much reason to care about her, and it is clear that Jaime is extremely disconnected despite being her father, it doesn't land all that well. It really just seems to be there in order to justify Cersei moving one rung further down the pit of madness, which is fine, but again, it asks viewers to fill in the relationship between Cersei and Marcella on their own. A lot of time is spent exploring Cersei's relationships with both Joffrey and Tommen, which makes the effects of those deaths clearly seen, but the lack of any developed relationship between Marcella and the characters mourning her makes it feel less important. I'm gonna catch flack for this next one, but even Hodor's death falls into a similar trap as these others. While it successfully paints his life in a tragic way, it comes after him and Bran being absent for an entire season. The moment mostly works because there isn't much to Hodor aside from but the power of him dying relies on the fact that he's a fan favorite more than anything else. His death and the backstory revealed from it does introduce a really interesting thread about the powers of the Three-Eyed Raven, but that never gets developed. And once Mira leaves the show, Hodor's sacrifice is forgotten. Sure, his death leads Bran to truly becoming the Three-Eyed Raven and eventually king, which is an interesting enough development on paper, but in execution, Bran pretty much just stares at people for the rest of the series and does nothing to prove that his powers make him uniquely suited to become king. Hodor's death could have led to a lot of interesting places, but the show moved too quickly to explore them. As for characters who die after stints of being irrelevant, Marjorie and Loras are prime examples. Both of them are important for a large portion of the series, but they die after being on the back burner for a handful of episodes, getting little screen time and not having much of an impact on the story. Their deaths are the final straw that pushes Olenna to side House Tyrell against the Lannisters, but the emotional fallout is never really explored. Also, Cersei gets away with murdering them, the High Sparrow, her uncle, and a handful of other people, and no one left in King's Landing seems to care. She doesn't undergo an investigation for the set blowing up on the day of her hearing or anything like that. This is especially puzzling because the entire idea of the Sparrows is that power comes from the many, and despite them indicating that there are many who support the High Sparrow, none of those people challenge Cersei for her actions. It is just forgotten about. In a show that has always been about consequences, the lack of meaningful ones here make all of their deaths feel more about convenience than anything else. Looking at the deaths of characters further south, pretty much all of them fall victim to the same issue. Dorne in general is underutilized in the show, and the characters from there, aside from Oberyn, are all given less development than Ghost, so when they started to die, I didn't really care. Dorne is propped up as a major power in Westeros, but the Martells and Sand Snakes aren't given enough screen time or development for that to really be felt. Doran Martell dies after pretty much doing nothing in the show, and his death feels like the writers given up on trying to make an intriguing arc for him. The Sand Snakes aren't developed enough to be interesting or likable, unlikable, so their deaths feel flat. Like when Cersei poisons Tyene and forces Ilaria to watch. While I understood why that would be traumatic for the characters involved, I couldn't really be bothered. Taking them out just seemed like a way to have less characters for the show to worry about. The list goes on. Thoros comes back so that it can die beyond the wall, mostly so there is at least some human cost for their ill-thought-out plan, and they were too much of cowards to kill Tormund. Benjen appears out of nowhere to save Jon and then dies, because Mance Rayder dies because the writers seemingly didn't want to get deeper into the magical elements of the story, which is a bummer because the Mance plotline in the books actually shows off how smart Jon is. Trystane Martell and Arya Hota are taken out right after being reintroduced in a seeming effort to further simplify the Dorne plot.
You're a greedy bitch, you know that?
Woonweg Woondar Woon dies in the Battle of the Bastards because someone on the good side had to, and the Blackfish, one of the coolest and most underutilized characters in the series, makes a brief reappearance before dying in the Siege of Riverrun, mostly because they abandoned the story thread from the book that involved his character. There are a handful of problems with killing characters in this way, but the biggest is that it feels emotionally manipulative. It's a way to get viewers to feel like a situation has high stakes by killing characters who seem important while not having to sacrifice the characters they have been putting the most focus into. This leads to arcs ending at unsatisfying times in a character's progression, and it feels like the writers abandoning plot threads in favor of having more time for the marquee characters. Maybe the best example of this is Sir Barristan's death. Despite still being a major player in the books, he dies early on in season 5, which surprised me because it happens well before the show caught up to its source material. This choice feels like the writers trying to make space for Tyrion as Hand of the Queen, but it leaves Barristan's arc feeling shortchanged. Also, none of the characters around him really seem to care that much about it, and his part in Dany's story feels a little pointless. Another issue is that some deaths started to become predictable, which made a lot of the tension in the show evaporate. For example, with Ramsay Bolton. Given the arc of the story to that point, there was no question in my mind that Jon and his forces would retake Winterfell. The Battle of the Bastards is shot in a suspenseful way, but the fight and the tension that goes with it feels like a formality, something that needed to get handled so the writers can move to the next plot point. Either Jon or Ramsay were going to die in that conflict, and given the direction the show was going, everyone knew it wouldn't be Jon. This doesn't mean Ramsay's death is entirely bad. It provides a much needed moment of catharsis for Sansa, which is satisfying, but it feels inevitable, making some of the drama leading up to it less powerful. Littlefinger's death is similar in a lot of regards. His attempts of trying to turn Arya and Sansa against each other are half-assed at best, and at the end of the day, Bran, the all-seeing three-eyed raven, can settle any question of whether or not Littlefinger is trying to play them. At no point did I think Littlefinger would get away with it, and it seemed pretty obvious that he would die, again making the tension of this plot thread feel like a formality. In general, all of these deaths lack the layers of ones from earlier in the series, where so many of the deaths in seasons 1 through 4 are of relevant characters that lead to emotional exploration and further conflict. The ones in the later seasons typically only have one of these three things. This makes it so the impact of these deaths never really reach the same heights as ones from earlier on. I do want to give credit where credit is due and talk about a few of the later deaths that stood out to me as being especially solid. The deaths of the men in the Night's Watch who were behind Jon's murder creates a bittersweet moment that ends the long-standing feud between Jon and Sir Alliser, and it causes Jon to leave the Night's Watch. It is sad and satisfying and starts to set the stage for the Battle of the Bastards. Tommen's death is also really well done. It is clear that at his core, he is a kind-hearted person, but he is young and naive and is led by those who are more clever than him. Once Joffrey dies, there is a strong sense that if someone could just get Cersei away from Tommen, the Seven Kingdoms might be able to live in peace. His death not only pushes Cersei to rock bottom, but it also means that the chance of there being unity between the Lannisters and any other house is non-existent. Lastly, I really liked Olenna's death, mostly because she dies as she lived.
Tell Cersei. I wanted to know it was me.
Savage as fuck. However, regardless of whether or not these deaths are done in a satisfying way, the bigger issue is that none of them are of core characters. I am sure some people will disagree with this assessment, but Jon Snow is the only major character who gets killed in seasons 5 through 7, and that doesn't count. It's fine to have deaths of minor characters. It is fine to have deaths meant to push forward the progression of the main cast. However, it becomes a problem when it is only more minor characters who die, especially because Game of Thrones established itself early on as a show willing to kill anyone. This made it so death stopped feeling like a threat that could happen to anyone and started being something that happened to characters who the writers felt were most expendable. The main cast acts in increasingly stupid ways and makes massive mistakes, but they don't get punished for those things. The amount of times that the show has tried to get me to to think Jon is about to die is comical. He constantly puts himself in situations that look to be insurmountable, but he gets through them with little to no issue. This is a far cry from where the show started. Consider Ned's beheading. As he is being sentenced to die, Arya starts running towards him, pulling out Needle. Based on all of the fantasy stories I had read in the past, and really just how fiction typically works, I expected her to reach him, parry Sir Ilan Payne's swing, cut her father free, and escape together. But that doesn't happen. She doesn't save him. Even if she could get to him, she'd just die. I remember being shocked that she didn't save the day, but A Song of Ice and Fire isn't that kind of story. It's not about epic heroes. It's about people. And people die. However, the show has moved closer to being an action-adventure than a story about people dealing with their mistakes. Like, Jaime charges at a dragon, and Bronn jumps in the way to save him, and somehow both of them live. This is the kind of action that in the past would have led to these characters being punished, but here there's nothing. It's a bummer because that could have been an extremely powerful end to either one of their character arcs. Bronn, the lovable cutthroat only in it for himself, decides to finally value someone else's life over his and dies to do so. Or Jaime, reminded of the acts of the Mad King and unable to escape from Cersei's hold over him, tries to repeat the act that gave him the title of Kingslayer in order to end the war and save his sister, and it ends up costing him his life. Given that the show ends Jaime's arc in a similar way, with him dying because he couldn't let go of Cersei, I think they would have benefited from killing him here. It would have created a complicated conflict between Tyrion and Dany, and given Cersei a more personal stake in the upcoming events. With that said, I would have preferred a more complete redemption arc where he dies in the Battle of Winterfell, saving Brienne, but really anything would have been better than what we got. The deaths of the major characters, the ones viewers have grown to love and hate, mostly happen in the span of 4 episodes, and it is too many deaths in such a short window for the show to properly explore them. I understand that the story needed to end at some point and that the emotional fallout of every character's death wouldn't be explored, but I can't help but feel that if they had placed some of the deaths earlier in the series, the pace of certain character arcs and the show in general would have made a lot more sense. There are a handful of characters who do not do a whole lot from Season 6 onward, and it kind of just feels like their deaths are being saved for the end. Had the show spread them out a little more, the stakes would have felt higher throughout, and the fallout of some of these deaths could have been further explored. The last season moves so quickly and has so little room for character development that there is barely any time to process anything. In the span of those 4 episodes, the Night King is destroyed, King's Landing and Cersei fall, Dany becomes the Mad Queen, and Jon kills her. Each of these conflicts could have had an entire season building up to them, so to have it all happen so quickly is a letdown. The Night King is built up as a massive, potentially world-ending threat. He is the typical evil fantasy bad guy, an embodiment of evil and destruction. There is no dealing to be done, no way to change his mind or course. He must be destroyed. Given the tone of the rest of the series, I feel like no matter what, his death would have been a bit of a letdown, because him dying follows the typical trope of good defeating evil, even though good took its sweet-ass time banding together. For me, the only way I think I'd find his arc satisfying is if he had won. I also think it would kind of be the most Game of Thrones ending possible. People were too busy squabbling over power and personal interest to save the world, so they lost. I get that would probably piss a lot of people off though. At the very least, his death should have led to greater consequences than it did. The conflict with him is underwhelming because it doesn't seem to cost the heroes all that much. The characters who die are the ones most viewers would expect. But imagine if Jon had died during the battle while landing the final blow to the Night King, or given an opening for someone else to. Not only would it be shocking and a solid end to Jon's story, but it would also create conflict for everyone else. Jon would not be there to try to ease tensions between Sansa and Dany. Maybe Sansa would refuse to send Northmen to King's Landing, leaving Dany with very few troops and no way to take the city without dragonfire. Tired of doing the right thing and coming away worse for it, she gives in to her worst instincts. This would make the Night King's conflict lead into something greater, instead of just feeling like a side quest that the heroes needed to do before finishing up the main campaign. As for Cersei, her death is unsatisfying for a handful of reasons. First off, she's not really that big of a character in Season 8. Aside from sipping wine and looking out of a window, she doesn't do much. She shows her fangs once by killing Missandei, but viewers don't get the Scheme Queen who they loved to hate. Also, despite setting up multiple characters who seemed like they'd be the one to kill Cersei, the writers thought it would be better to subvert expectations and let her roof do the job, which just isn't that satisfying. Lastly, her death ends up being portrayed in a way where it seems like viewers are supposed to feel sorry for her, but that payoff didn't land for me because the season didn't really build to it. All in all, Cersei in Season 8 doesn't really feel like Cersei, and because of that, her death has little emotional impact, positive or negative. Honestly, the only real sadness I felt in that moment was that it was Lena Headey's Dany's last scene in the show. Give her that, me. Lastly, Dany. While I don't mind the idea of her becoming the Mad Queen, the show's execution of getting her there is sloppy. Yes, she has always spouted the fire and blood rhetoric, and she spends a lot of time destroying slavers, corrupt nobles, and murderous culls, but those acts are done mostly out of necessity. They are done to people who deserve it. That's not the case in King's Landing. She isn't provoked, she doesn't need to do it, but she chooses to anyway. And for me, it didn't feel like a natural progression. She became a genocidal monster, a character who was completely illogical, a character that didn't feel like Dany anymore. So at that point, Jon killing her became the only way their arcs could end. They set it up in a way where it was the logical thing to do. It's a shame because with a little more time, her turn and death could have been a lot more interesting. If she had been put into a situation where destroying King's Landing seemed to be the only feasible way to win it, her progression would have felt more natural. Instead of acting solely on vindictive anger, she'd be crossing the moral line she had always walked along in the past. I think this would make her and her death a lot more compelling because it would be less clear that she has moved beyond the point of no return. It would be hard to differentiate her actions from the actions of other kings and queens who wage wars and send thousands to their death in the name of power. This would have caused me to actually ruminate on how I felt about her dying instead of just thinking, yeah, sure, makes sense. Dany is built up to be a revolutionary who is conflicted about what the cost of freedom should be, but the writers decided to go in the Targaryens are crazy route, painting Jon's choice as black or white. For a show that spends so much time in morally gray areas, this is disappointing. I wish the series had more time to explore all of these conflicts and arcs to more satisfying ends. Between poor pacing and there just not being enough seasons, the show ran out of track and they had to find an end, leading to things feeling abrupt. Where the first 4 seasons spaced out their deaths and had them occur when the character dying was most relevant, the final 4 mostly killed characters who were far less relevant to the story and held the major deaths until the end. Game of Thrones became popular because it was daring. It was exhilarating to watch because every character was in danger of being destroyed by their mistakes, but that threat faded away, and so did some of the magic of the series. The way death is handled in the later seasons is not the only issue with the show, but it is definitely the thing that frustrated me the most. There are still plenty of incredible moments in those later seasons, and some of them do revolve around death. But the shifts with how the show approached killing characters, focusing more on simplifying conflicts and shocking audiences with brutality, made Game of Thrones feel less like Game of Thrones. The later seasons feel like a different show, and I think this is a huge part of why people are so frustrated with the series. The show they became connected to, the one about living with loss and trying to find a place in the world, turned into one that closer resembled the typical fantasy stories we've grown used to. One about nearly invincible heroes, constant large-scale battles, and good defeating evil. The show that was all about the slow burn gave way for a faster-paced epic adventure, and while the direction of the later seasons isn't all awful, it lost the edge that set it apart. As I said before, there are many ways and reasons to kill a character, and ultimately it comes down to the kind of tone a writer wants to set and the risks they are willing to take. What I've learned from Game of Thrones is that the death of a character is most impactful when it has multiple purposes, when it happens to characters who are important to the overall narrative, when it gives viewers and other characters the chance to process and grieve, and when the fallout of the death is lasting. It is most impactful when it feels like real life, because then it is truly something viewers can relate to. And for a while at least, Game of Thrones did this better than any other show.
Looks like we're done here.